of racism now. This is going to be very helpful for us. Because sometimes when we talk about racism, we think like there's only one type of it, but there are several types. So let's start with two: dominative racism and aversive racism. So what is dominative racism? That is the desire by some people to dominate or control members of another group. This was the case in the southern US under slavery and Jim Crow. Okay? So in other words, dominative racism is a kind of racism that is primarily concerned about domination. There's a hierarchy there. I am at the top, you are at the bottom. This is the number one principle in this society. If you're going to live in this society, you have to be prepared to accept that. We are at the top and you are at the bottom. And the interesting about dominative racism is that even though it has this idea of superiority or whatever, in the southern part of the United States, there was peace if the black people were willing to accept this membership in the hierarchy. And the white people were willing to interact. And actually they interact, you have slaves. There's a way they interact. Some of the black people were working as housemates in the house of the white people or something like that. So there was close interaction there. The only thing guiding that interaction is this idea of superiority and inferiority. We're going to interact, but remember that I am here, you're down. If you're willing to accept that, that's fine. There will be no problem. But if you become, as a black person, uppity, you're trying to move up, or you're trying to tell me that we're equal, then there is going to be trouble there, okay? So remember that in the southern part of the United States at one point, if a black person was walking on the sidewalk, if a white person is coming, they have to move off the sidewalk. If they are wearing a hat, they have to remove the hat as a mark of respect or all those kind of things. And it was fine because for the dominant group, because it indicates that the black person, recognized that this person recognized they are inferior, okay? So insofar as the inferior person or the person defined as inferior is willing to accept that, then that's fine for the dominant group, okay? So that's dominative racism. The idea is always that there's one group that is at the top and they're always going to dominate. But what is aversive racism? Aversive racism is the kind of racism that took place in the northern part of the United States. So here you do not have slavery, and in most cases you don't have, not that you do not have, there was still racial discrimination and things like that, but it was not like in the South. But what we mean by aversive racism is that the North would say, okay, black people can stay here or whatever, I'm not enslaving you or anything like that or something like that. But the problem is that I don't want to have anything to do with you. I don't want to go to the same church with you. I don't want to be in the same coffee shop with you. I don't want my children to go to the same school or something like that. So the idea is just that I want to avoid you. If I see you in the elevator, I'm not going to get into the elevator. I will wait until you go, and then I'll take the elevator or something like that. So it is aversive. Aversive simply means you are trying to avoid. If you see the black person going into the restroom and you want to go to the restroom, you wait until the black person comes out, then you go because you just don't want to be close to a black person or something like that, okay? So aversive racism is the racism of the North. In the US, it is expressed in the desire to avoid contact with blacks or other minorities rather than the desire to subjugate them, as in dominative racism. Now, there was one documentary film I was reviewing when Martin Luther King Jr. visited Chicago. He said that the kind of racism in Chicago was even worse than the kind of racism at one point in the South. Why? Because remember that I mentioned to you that in the case of dominative racism, if black people were willing to accept what the dominant group defined them as, there would be relative peace. The only thing is if the black people decide to assert themselves, then there's going to be a problem. But the white people interacted with blacks. Some of the slave masters, in spite of any feeling of superiority, they could not resist some of the black women, their attractiveness or whatever, and they had children with them, okay? So they had children with them, so that indicates that there was intimacy or something like that, okay? But in the North, you had this kind of desire to avoid. So when you are trying to avoid somebody, it's going to be difficult. You are not going to meet in the same church. You are not going to live in the same neighborhood or whatever or something like that. You are talking about segregation. And this segregation is not taking place by law, but it is just taking place sometimes by the way the system really operates itself. So just understand these two types of racism, dominative and aversive. And the aversive one is more difficult to fight. Why? Because it's easier for you to point at the oppression that is taking place under dominative racism. But sometimes in order for you to deal with aversive racism, you have to be sophisticated in your analysis. Okay, then other types of racism. Cultural racism. It is a whole conglomeration of cultural ideas, beliefs, arguments, which transmit mistaken notions about the attributes and capabilities of racial groups. It refers to the attributes of a society's culture rather than beliefs by individuals, okay? So here, when we talk about cultural racism, we're not talking about racism that is just happening just by an individual accidentally or something like that. But in the whole culture, there are certain myths that are passed from one generation to the other about the inferiority of certain groups. They just become part and parcel of the culture. If you go online, for instance, you check some CNN documentary films about dolls, black dolls in Chicago, you're going to see how small kids, white kids or black kids, already had developed opinions about racism or racial relationship, okay? So culture, it is because of the culture, children see what is happening every day. You don't have to sit them down and teach them. They just see it and they observe it and they internalize it, okay? So that's what we mean by cultural racism. And one way that we transfer cultural racism from one generation to the other is through language, through our mores or folkways, just the customs that exist in the society. It passed down just unquestioned, sometimes unconsciously, okay? So that's cultural racism. Personal racism is the expression of negative feelings, attitude towards certain racial ethnic minorities by an individual, especially in face-to-face contact. So what does that mean? I gave you the example of, for instance, if I am going to the restroom and then there's another white person going to the restroom and they realize that I'm a black person and then they decided to go back to wait until I finish, then they get in, then that would be an expression of like personal racism. Or getting into the elevator, or I'm in the elevator and somebody realizes, just like, oh no, let me allow them to go or something like that, okay? So this is something that is expressed in face-to-face. It could be in a store, okay? Somebody sees you and assumes that you're shoplifting or something like that just because of your race or something like that, okay? Okay, so that's personal. It's different from cultural. Cultural is at the systemic level. And then we have symbolic racism. It is not expressed directly, but rather indirectly through opposition to programs that seek to improve the status of minorities in society. Example provided by Newman, blacks are getting too demanding in their push for equal rights. Okay, so what does this mean? Symbolic racism simply means that we are now in an era of politically correct. Politically correct simply means even if you don't like members of certain racial group, you cannot come out directly and talk about it because it can get you into trouble and all those kind of things, okay? Even if you feel you have the freedom, your employer, your organization may not like that and all those kind of things, okay? So what happens with symbolic racism is that you look for something that is a symbol of that group and then you try to criticize that. So when we became a more politically correct society, people will begin to criticize culture, the culture of minorities rather than minorities themselves. But there's no culture that is existing in empty space, in empty vacuum or something like that. It's always created by some people. But the idea here is just that you criticize certain things that are kind of related to minorities, like affirmative action, for instance. Okay? Affirmative action is one of those things that people have criticized really very, very much as it is reverse discrimination or something like that. Okay? Because it is favoring minorities. Now, there's a guy called Ira Carls Nelson who wrote a book titled When Affirmative Action Was White. And when you look at it in this book, he documents the fact that there was a time when if affirmative action means you're giving people preferential treatment because of their racial or certain ascribed qualities, then you have to understand that for a very long time in the United States, white people have received preferential treatment just because of their skin color or something like that. So that was affirmative action. Okay? But most of the time when people talk about, they criticize about affirmative action to minorities or women, they are not concerned about the affirmative action that took place for whites for a very long time. And that's why Ira Carls Nelson decided to title his book, When Affirmative Action Was White. So the point we're just saying here is just that symbolic racism simply means the person is not directly talking about racism. You have to be sophisticated enough to understand that that's where they're getting at, but they don't want to talk about it directly. But let me broaden this discussion. If you really understand what we're really talking about here, you can have symbolic sexism, okay? Where somebody is not directly criticizing women or whatever gender, whatever you like, but when they would be doing something that is symbolic of women, but not directly talking about women. You have to be sophisticated enough to understand that this is where this person is heading to, but in a very sophisticated language, okay? So symbolic racism is something that has become very much common. People criticize culture, but there is no culture that has not been created by people. Okay? And then finally, another type of racism is called institutional racism. Now, let me put this in context. Okay? When some of you are aware that there's a lot of discussion going on about critical race theory or whatever, it's up to you to believe what you want to believe, but I just want to explain this in a very scholarly way. When critical race theory started, it originally started in legal studies. Okay, so it was not part of the social sciences. It was later that the debate moved on into the social sciences. And when you look at the logic of critical race theory, actually what it means in the social sciences is institutional racism. So the next type of racism is called institutional racism. So what is institutional racism? And we're going to find out that there are different types of institutional racism, which means like even when you're going to talk about critical theory, there are different dimensions of it. So it's not just like one idea, okay? So institutional racism consists of established laws, customs, practices that systematically reflect and produce racial inequalities in society, whether or not the individuals maintaining these practices have racist intentions. Now, this definition can actually make a lot of people feel very, very uncomfortable. Why? The reason why it is going to make many people uncomfortable is simply because they say you do not necessarily have to have the racist intentions. You can have institutional racism without necessarily having the racist intentions. So what does that mean? Before I even talk about it, just to show you that this is a global discussion, when you go to, say, for instance, African countries, you will find out that during the anti-colonial struggle, there are some ethnic groups in African countries that ended up shaping the constitution more in their own image as an ethnic group or religious group than other minority ethnic groups. So the image, or if you like, the cultural, whatever dominative aspect of that group became part and parcel of the way the political system in that country was structured. And so those that are minorities now have to deal with this whole institution, the constitution itself, bias in favor of certain people, the way it was defined from the beginning. Okay? And if it is from the beginning bias, it means if you want to reassert yourself, it's a struggle. You have to organize. And when you organize, you are not sure whether you're going to succeed or not. So the point I'm trying to make here is just that in the United States, when people talk about institutional racism, they tend to think like it is just a simple question of white people versus the other. But if you understand the logic, there is this institutional exclusion taking place in other societies, just like institutional racism, so that, as I said much earlier, simply because people in Africa or other parts of the world are black, if they understand this conversation really very well, they cannot in any way think like they are inherently morally superior because there is no institutional racism there or something like that. And why is it that institutional racism can exist without racist intentions? So what that simply means, for instance, like let me give another example, like using African countries. When a constitution is designed in such a way that it favors certain dominant ethnic group or religious group, the problem is that there are many generations that will come later on, even if they are not people who have bias against other minority ethnic groups in those countries, but they will benefit from the system. They will continue to keep the system because at least it is the constitution. Unless you are able to organize and change it, it is still the constitution. You have to use it the way it is, okay? And this is the same thing with institutional racism. You have certain laws or something like that that were designed or something like that. The assumption at that time was just that this is just like the dominant culture is white or something like that, okay? So now anybody who is minority will have to fit into this kind of system. Now, in the future, there are many people who may not have any negative intention against minorities or something like that. But because that's the system that we inherited, we have to deal with that. Okay? So I hope this helps in people understand what institutional racism really is. If you really understand it very well, it's not just some problem that you think is just a problem of white people, because if you take away racism, you can have institutional sexism. You can have so many other things. Okay. Then 5 types of institutional racism. So there are 5 types of institutional racism, and this is something very important, because for those of you who are very interested in critical race theory, it's almost like getting into a little bit of that here to say that there are so many dimensions of the theory. So let's look at that. Okay. 1, conspiracy version. This occurs when those in position of power in public institutions deliberately set out to discriminate against racial groups. So what does this mean? What this simply means in terms of conspiracy version of institutional racism is that these people are very deliberate, they are very intentional. They call a meeting, they sit down. The purpose of this meeting is for us to pass a law that would make it impossible for this minority group or these people who are minority to be able to achieve this or whatever. We can keep them where they are. Okay, that's why it is called the conspiracy version. Okay, and probably it is the worst version that can take place, because here it is a situation where people are deliberate. They just want to achieve this goal of keeping these people out. And then the second version is the structural Marxist view. And the structural Marxist view can equally generate a lot of reaction among some people because of the way it is defined. Institutional racism does not depend upon the existence of conscious prejudice and discrimination. They argue that racism results from the consequences of state policy regardless of the intentions behind it. So what does this mean? Let me explain it so that people can really understand. So if, for instance, you have a state that in the Constitution, maybe in the Constitution have all this language about freedom, equality, this and that, and whatever, okay? That's fine. There's nothing in the language of the Constitution that suggests racism or anything like that. But the problem is, if over 10 years, 15 years, or 30 years, the result of the implementation of that Constitution or the laws of that state still ended up creating a situation where it is only people of a certain racial group that are moving up, and then the members of another racial group, other racial groups or minorities are either where they are or moving down, then according to this structural Marxist view of institutional racism, then that is institutional racism. Because it is institutional racism because of its result. Okay? So if I am a professor, for instance, and I teach a class, and always it's a certain group of students, because of their race or whatever, not necessarily related to their performance that are doing this or whatever, and I keep the thing like that, and over a long period of time, and I don't raise questions about it or something like that, because I have worked with so many students, and I found out that given the appropriate training and background, students from different backgrounds can do very, very well. Okay? So for this reason, what we are saying here is just that it is about the result. The result is really very, very important. Now, there are limitations to this Marxist something, okay? But the point I'm trying to say here that we should be conscious. I can have good intentions toward you, good intentions. But if what I'm doing is putting you down, even though I have good intentions, I have to have the humility and re-examine myself and say, Samuel, even though you have good intentions, but the result of what you're doing over a long period of time has kept this person down. Okay, enough about that. And then the third type of institutional racism is called unintended consequence version. This approach to institutional racism argues that institutions in society can lead to racial disadvantages and inequality as a consequence of following policies that were not designed to be racist. There are many laws or policies that we have that are never intended to be racist, okay? But because there are other factors that, together with race, can put some people down. What do I mean by that? Like gender, like socioeconomic background, like the family that somebody comes from can make a huge difference in terms of what they're able to achieve, and so many other factors, okay? So all these things can combine together. So the policies are neutral, okay? But unfortunately, so it is unintended, but because we're trying to enforce those good policies, we end up creating something else, okay? That can become racial. So for instance, we want to admit students that are really well prepared to succeed in their studies, because if a student is not well prepared, they may not be able to succeed. But then you find out, if you check history or if you check the data very well, you're going to find out that most of the students that tend to be unprepared are either students that come from, I'm not saying all, but most of them tend to come from either disadvantaged background or minority backgrounds. And there are good reasons for that. I don't have the time to get into the details here, okay? So, but the admissions officer in a university or college is just trying to do his or her job, okay? These are the requirements. And based on history, we need people with this minimum performance in order for them to succeed or something like that. So some of these students may not get admission, or even if they get admission, because the standards in that school may be very, very high, they may not be able to make progress in their studies, you see? And then over time, if students from certain backgrounds tend to fall out, then it may look like it is racist or something like that, but it's not really intended that way, okay? Okay, and then the fourth type of institutional racism is colonialism version. The colonialism version says, this suggests that the role in which racial or ethnic minority groups enters a society can result in institutional racism when initial disadvantages create long-term inequalities because ethnic minority groups tended to be located at the bottom of their society's stratification system, and upward social mobility is extremely difficult to realize. So let me give you an example very quickly to illustrate this. I read Alexis de Tocqueville's book, Democracy in America, and after reading it, there's a way in which it brought the history of Native Americans very close to my heart. Okay, why? Because when Europeans came to this country, they wanted to create a civilization. And they invited the Native Americans to be part of that civilization. But the Native Americans realized that there's a kind of hierarchy here in this civilization. The white people may not have noted that, or the Europeans. But the Native Americans realized that if we join this civilization, we are going to join it at the bottom of the hierarchy. And when we join it at the bottom of the hierarchy, how long is it going to take for us to move up? And whether we move up or not, it's not up to us. It is up to the powers that be in this new civilization to decide whether they are going to allow us to move up or not. Okay? So what did the Native Americans do? In many cases, when the white community moved west, the Native Americans will move further west. And then gradually, the white community will still move there and move close to them, but they move further away. The Native American felt that you can say that he didn't, or they didn't have what the Europeans had, but they felt more freer because there's no hierarchy in the sense that they are free to move around. But if they join this new civilization from the bottom, oh my God, who knows when they are going to rise up? So that's what the colonialist version is really talking about here. Okay? So it's a hierarchy that is created, and if you're a minority, you enter it from the bottom, and who knows when you're going to move up. Okay? Okay, and then finally, the last type of institutional racism is called political opportunism version. So what is political opportunism? This approach to institutional racism claims that institutional racism results not so much from prejudices, but from the workings of the democratic process. Political groups will try to gain votes by taking advantage of race, like any other issue, to increase their popularity, since the primary aim of all politicians is to win elections and get re-elected. So what does this mean? And this is true not only in the United States, but in other countries. In other countries, it is ethnicity. If you go to many African countries, for instance, you find out that there are politicians who have used the sentiment of ethnicity to divide and rule. So the argument here is that political opportunism simply means institutional racism continues because there are politicians who realize that if they want to continue to remain in office, they have to play the race card. If they don't play the race card, they are not going to really succeed. Privately, they may know that this is not good, but politically, if they want to succeed, they have to use that. Now, some politicians who are unable to do that probably will just say, no, I'm not going to continue. I don't think I will be able to do this because it's in conflict with my values, okay? But this is the same thing in many countries, in other parts of the world. In India, do you use Hindu sentiment, okay, to win an election or something like that? So the idea here is that political opportunism version is just saying that institutional racism persists or exists, but just it is an opportunity for you to win an election or something like that, okay? So as you can see from this discussion of different types of racism, there's no simple way to engage this kind of discussion. There's no one statement. We need to have a lot of dialogue about that, okay? And as I have tried to explain to you, I deliberately went off sometimes just trying to give you examples from outside the United States because I want the listener to really understand that this is something that has deeply to do with the human condition, okay? The question of power, the question of how do you decide to use power, and do you make yourself feel superior and then use your power to treat other people as inferior? Now, to conclude this discussion or this lecture on race, I would like to ask two questions, conclude by two questions. Very, very important. And this is based on the ideas of Robert K. Martin. Robert K. Martin asked this question, two questions. Can someone hold racist worldview and not discriminate? Okay? Can someone hold racist worldview and not discriminate? And the answer is yes. So under what context? Okay? So the point here is that somebody can have a racist worldview, but let's say they are going to get employment in any of the corporations in the United States or any of the universities or colleges. And some of the universities and colleges in the United States have a strong position against racism. Okay? It's well established. When you check, you're going to see that. They have strong positions against that. And they will tell the person from the beginning when the person is employed, we want you to succeed here. But just understand that this is our system. We don't tolerate sexism. We don't tolerate religious bigotry, or we don't tolerate racism, sexism, and all those kind of things. So if you want to succeed, just understand that this is the organizational culture. Okay? And so what will happen in that case is that even if the individual privately has a racist worldview, if they want to succeed in their career, they will either have to change or they will have to keep their racist worldview until when they go home or when they are with their friends and they talk about it. But even then, if they make the mistake sometimes while holding a position of responsibility in that organization and then expose themselves in a private conversation that becomes public where they clearly communicate that they are racist or they are sexist or something like that, they may end up losing their job. So this kind of person is called a timid bigot. The person is a bigot, but they are timid in the sense that they want to keep their job or they are afraid of the consequences of the law, because in some places, if you do anything that is sexist or racist or whatever, you may end up getting into trouble with the legal system. Okay? So here, Martin is just trying to show that the kind of reward system that exists in the society can force people to change their racist worldview, because they realize that if they keep their racist worldview, it may affect their opportunity to thrive and flourish in the system. Okay? Now, the other question is, can someone discriminate against other racial groups even though he or she is not racist? Here we're talking about a person that he is not racist or she is not racist, but they end up discriminating against other people. Why? Personally, the person believes that racism is bad, either because of their religious beliefs or because of their moral beliefs or something like that. They say, it's bad, I'm not, I don't accept this or whatever. But in reality, they end up discriminating against other racial groups. Why? Now, the argument here, this kind of person is called all-weather liberal. All-weather liberal, it simply means he's just or she's just willing to do whatever the group is doing. So in this case, let's say the person does not have a racist worldview, but they join an organization and they find out that in that organization, part of the organizational culture is to discriminate against minorities. Okay? That's the way they make their money, or that's the way they succeed. Maybe this may be something done privately, it's not known in public or something, but that's the way the business is conducted. And this person wants to thrive and flourish in that business. So what do? They just join the bandwagon because it's going to be rewarding to them. And remember that in the southern part of the United States, there are many people who live there who were not racist or did not have a racist worldview. But because the culture demands that, they say you have to comply or whatever, they ended up complying and then they became just discriminating against black people. Otherwise, they would have to move out of the region or something like that. So this can happen equally in Africa with ethnicity. It can happen with ethnicity. It can happen with sexism. Just to broaden the discussion, somebody who may not believe in sexist views personally, but when they join an organization and they find out that for them to thrive in the organization, they have to adopt or accept this. And sometimes they compromised. They did that. So if you understand this discussion, we're having this discussion on race, but it's good when you understand something, you broaden the meaning of that discussion. And so even if you are not somebody having a racist worldview, don't think that this discussion is just about racism. If you understand the logic, it can happen in the area of religion, it can happen in the area of gender, it can happen in the area of ethnicity, even though it is not race. So thank you very much.